So taking a look at the configuration between the two. So here under the APIC, under VMM networking, we would click on policies and then right-click on either Microsoft if we're doing Hyper-V or VMware if we're doing vCenter, and we would create, let's say in this case, a vCenter domain. We would then give it a name. We would optionally choose a security domain if we want to use role-based control. We're going to choose the type of switch, whether it's VMware Distributed or Cisco AVS, the AEP, as well as the VLAN pool that we're pulling from. And then we would go ahead and provide the vCenter credentials, username and password, and then the vCenter or vShield, was an animation for that, IP address, and then correlate the IP address to the credentials. So here we see just a picture of the credentials, nothing real fancy there. And we didn't see a picture of the IP address, but that's fine. So with the credentials, we do have to keep in mind that let's say we're using a vCenter server appliance, which is just a VM that you can download as vCenter. It doesn't allow for large scalability, but it works great for a lab and even for smaller customers or medium-sized customers. The username would be root. If we're using a large installation of vCenter, we're probably doing it on, let's say, Microsoft Server 2008 or 2012 or something like that, and whatever's supported right now for an OS. And the username would most likely be administrator. However, a lot of times, especially in large environments, VM admins don't want to give full root or full administrator access to anyone, even if they know and they're giving the person, in this case, the APIC or ACI administrator, the capability of doing some things like creating a distributed virtual switch. They only want to give them a subset of credentials. So essentially, they want to provide role-based access control to us. So this is perfectly possible. In the vCenter administrator, we can create a specific custom role under Home Administration Roles. And when we give this the role, the privileges that we have to assign are alarms, data center, distributed switch, distributed virtual port group, or DVS port group, folder creation and deletion, host, network, and that should be it. So we can call this whatever we like. In this case, we called it AVS role. Once we do that, then the new vCenter credentials that we gave would specifically be that of that AVS or whatever we called it, that new role. And then, of course, we would define the IP address. And again, it matters whether you're using vCenter alone or vCenter plus vShield. And the reason is ACI needs to know, is it going to use VLAN IDs with vCenter alone for the port group creation, or is it going to use VXLAN network IDs, VNIDs, for the port group creation when we're doing vShield? Now, the one thing, well, really the name that we call it here doesn't matter. That's local to us. I recommend you name it something intuitive, not just vCenter, especially if you have multiple. The IP address obviously has to be right. The DVS version most likely will be 5.5 unless you've moved on, and 6.0 is supported and you're using that. Statistics collection, we can actually collect statistics about the VMs. It's disabled by default, but you very well may want to collect those, especially if you're going to be running reports or API, REST API calls against the APIC and gathering information not just about the VM endpoints that have been learnt, but also about their statistics, transmit, receive, things of that nature. And that's going to be very useful in Troubleshooting Wizard that we'll see later. The data center name, this is something that is specific to the vCenter installation. And vCenter might have multiple data centers. These are not necessarily physical, but can be representative of. But these are logical data centers in the VMware vCenter. And the name has to be exact. So if we accidentally name this, DC-1, and in vCenter it's called DC1, well, the two aren't going to coordinate, and the DVS will not get created because it's going to make the API call to vCenter and say, create a DVS named vCenter, and create it in data center DC-1, and vCenter is going to say, I don't know what that is. It's not going to offer, a close, name. We're going to put the associated credential. The management EPG, you can leave blank if you're doing out of band, meaning if actually, let's say the APIC is talking to vCenter through its out of band management. So basically it's management 0 or it's 1 gig E port. If it's talking to vCenter here, then you can just leave that field blank. However, if the APIC and the vCenter are connected through one or even multiple leaf switches, let's say 102, and this vCenter is actually let's just say the vCenter is connected to the leaf switch, which of course we have our fabric up here, and the APIC is connected, not its 1 gig management out of band, that's not typically how we ever do that, but it's using its single or double, in-band connections, and it's going to be talking over in-band management, which we haven't talked too much about setting up, but we will. Actually, we talked a little bit about it in one of the first modules. We'll go into that demo, or maybe you've already watched that demo at this point. But when we set up the in-band management, we would have had to have already set that up in an in-band management EPG, and then we could talk to the vCenter in-band through the fabric. So if that's what we're doing, then we would select the management EPG. Otherwise, we'll leave this blank for out of band. So once we've created this and completed the wizard, then we'll see this under policies, and we would also be able to see inventory. And once we expanded VMware provider DC1, the VM controller of vCenter, we might have multiple. Then once we finish some next tasks, which we'll look at here now, then we would, under inventory, begin to see the actual VMs. So over in ACI, we see that under home inventory networking, and this is the actual Windows-based client. You can see all of this through the web client as well, which I recommend. But we see the DVS that was created under DC1 data center. So notice there was also DC2. The DVS was created under DC1. And we see that by default, it only has an uplink. It doesn't have any other port groups. And port groups look like either a kind of a little switch here with a network card, if they're uplinks, or they look like this, where they actually have kind of a little world sitting or attached to a wire. So those are host or really virtual machine facing port groups, optionally VMK, VM kernel management port groups, and then the ones with the little nick are the uplinks. So at this point, we can see through tenants, we have, let's say, Coke, and we have an application profile. We go to the EPG, and we go ahead and we associate the VMM domain. So once we've associated the VMM domain, we should then see a port group. See with a little switch with the world, we should see a VM port group that's created and can now be consumed by virtual machines. Now, of course, one of the things not necessarily shown here that we would still have to do is go, and we will do this in the demonstration, we'll do all of it from scratch, is we would go into the DVS and we would click on hosts and we would add our hosts, and then we would go over to those hosts and we'd grab the VMs and we'd associate them to the port groups. So now let's begin taking a look at the ACI hypervisor integration with VMware using the ACI plugin method. So this is where the VM admin is going to essentially be able to do everything from their side alone. I shouldn't say everything. There is a little bit of a caveat. We still do have to create. The APIC admin still has to create here the VMM networking and create the provider over to the APIC, or sorry, over to the vCenter. So it's still the responsibility of the APIC administrator to create the VM policy or the VMM domain. As well, they have to do everything on the fabric side, or we have to do everything on the fabric side. So we still have to create our AEP, our Attachable Entity Profile, and map that to a VMM domain. At the VMM domain, we still have to also map a VLAN pool, whether it's static, if we're going to statically assign the VLANs, or dynamic, if we're going to let APIC choose. We still have to attach that AEP to the interface policy group. We still have to attach the interface policy group to the interface profile and interface selector. And then we still have to attach the interface profile to the switch profile. So all of that still has to be done. Once we've gone ahead and mapped all that out, and we've created all of those entities and associations in Fabric access policies, and then the VMM policy to integrate with vCenter, then we're actually ready for the VM admin to begin automating and managing everything themselves. So there is one other thing that we have to do, and I don't show it here in the slides, but we will do it live, is we have to register the ACI plugin. So this is something where we have to log into the vSphere web interface, actually the vSphere web client, right? Not the Windows-based client. There's no support for that there. In fact, VMware is discontinuing support for the client-based interface. Everything is web client now. So we have to register the ACI plugin. Once we do, we see it show up here, and we can click on that. When we click on it, we see that a number of things are grayed out. We have 0 of a lot of things in the inventory. We have no APIC nodes, no ACI fabrics discovered, no tenants, subnets, application network profiles, or just called application profiles, or port groups, what ACI calls endpoint groups, EPGs. Okay, and we see this nice picture that kind of shows us this perspective of servers, both virtualized and non-virtualized bare metal, as well as our vCenter, attached to our fabric, our pair of spines, our, in this case, 3 leafs, and our APIC cluster sitting on top. And we see this overlay of tenants, application network profiles, EPGs or VMware port groups. Okay? So we're going to go ahead and connect our vSphere to our ACI fabric. We'll provide the IP address and username password of the APIC. And from there, we'll see that we actually have an APIC node and an ACI fabric. Now, in a production environment, you'd see 3 nodes, hopefully, and 1 fabric. From there, we would create a new tenant. Once we create a new tenant, we give it a name, we give it a description of our choosing, we give it 1 or more gateways or subnets, and these create the subnet or SVI under the bridge domain. So for a tenant, it automatically names and creates the bridge domain. We don't have to worry about that. If we want more than 1 gateway, we can do that. And then we select the location for the tenant. Okay, so in this case, which fabric if we're joined to multiple fabrics. So then we see back in the APIC administration interface the tenant. Now notice that back here in the ACI plugin, in the vSphere web interface, I called it VM-tenant-1. And so here we see VM tenant 1 created with the description I gave it. Now notice here in the APIC, of course I always have common infra and management. Those 3 are there by default and we can't delete them. But I also have already created tenant 8. Now when we go back to, in just a moment, when we go back here to the VMware vSphere web client, notice that the vSphere web client, really the vCenter, only sees 1 tenant. So even though there was already an existing tenant 8, we don't essentially, or the ACI plugin in the vCenter does not do learning or discovery of what we've already created manually. This is actually really nice. It could be viewed as a kind of a downside, I suppose, but the idea is that whatever the VMware admin creates, we want this to be completely isolated from anything that we create. So we don't want there to be any exposure of the tenants or anything else that we're manually creating, or even through the RESTful API or cloud orchestration platform creating in our APIC. We might have, let's say, for instance, we might have a service provider, public or private virtual private cloud, or even co-location or something like that, facility, and we're using ACI to provide this overlay to our customers. Now, wherever this one customer is attached, maybe they're attached to cage 2 and they have 4 top-of-rack switches, and I've already set up the fabric access policy that anything that comes in on those 4 switches is all attached to a single VMM domain, and I've pointed that to their vCenter, and then I've just said, here's the ACI plugin, you go from there. So anything that they create gets created in ACI as an overlay, right? And they can consume ACI as a service, if you will. They have an overlay that they can provision themselves, which is what a lot of customers want to do. Maybe they want to do it through a web front-end portal. Maybe they just want to do it through a simple, well-known and used, vCenter interface. So they create and provision and whatever all of their own overlay information, but we're still using ACI for other tenants, and we don't want to expose those to the tenant that we're providing this ACI as a service to. So anything that we manually create here, whether already created or whether newly created, won't be exposed to that ACI plugin in vCenter, won't be exposed to vCenter. That's very nice. So here we can see that in the APIC, under the tenant VM-tenant-1, the application profile was automatically created, and we can create more if we want. No EPGs have been created yet. The bridge domain was automatically created. And with this ACI plugin, it's only one bridge domain, only one private network or VRF. So if you want more, the ACI plugin is probably not what you're looking for. It's for simplified administration from the VMware admin perspective, or from a customer tenant that I'm exposing this to. The subnet is automatically created. Now, if you recall, I had the ability to create multiple subnets back in the vSphere web client. If I had done so, they would have all been secondary IPs under this primary bridge domain, okay, called vCenter default BD. So back in the web client, I could now create a ACI port group, and as I do so, I give it a name, whatever I choose, optional description, and I choose not only which fabric, which tenant, but which application profile, because I can create multiple APs or ANPs. And once I say OK, now I can also say connect this ACI port group to the tenant's default security, basically allowing all traffic. And we have a separate section up here that we're not going to go into now, but we'll take a look at in the demonstration portion for connectivity and security. And we can create very fine-tuned, very granular rules of what ports, SSH, what applications, HTTP, etc., that we want to allow between or from and to certain port groups. Or if we want to just have default, we can connect it to the default security zone and allow all traffic. So then back in the vSphere web client, or really still in the vSphere web client, we would go over to our hosts and VMs or just our virtual machines. We would choose the virtual machine, edit its settings. We'd go into the network adapter, choose the newly created tenant:/ANP:/EPG, or what we just see as a distributed virtual switch port group, and then we would choose OK. And at this point, back in the APIC, we now see under the tenant, we see the new EPG, we see the domain. Actually, I don't have clicked on the domain, but you would see that the domain was automatically associated. So again, we, the APIC admin, had pre-created it, but the ACI plugin had done the association. So we see some default contracts, subjects, and the default everything filter. And even though we don't have clicked on the contracts for the EPG, it's basically provided and consumed. So anyone that's on that default security is provided and consumed for this permit all contract. And we can see that if we're clicked on the EPG and we've clicked on the operational tab and the client endpoints, we have discovery. Okay? Notice the VLAN was nowhere in there. So this is all dynamic VLAN association. So under Fabric Access Policies, we would have needed, for the ACI plugin, we would have needed to create a dynamic VLAN pool and attach that to the VMM domain. So to the best of my knowledge, I haven't found it that static VLAN IDs are supported there. But again, they don't really need to be, because the VM admin is going to create this port group as they see it, which will create a ACI EPG. and then they're just going to put VMs in there. So they don't necessarily at that point care about what the VLAN ID is or VXLAN ID. All they care about is, are the VMs in the same port group or are they in different port groups? If they're in different, is there contracts or are there security rules that allow them to talk? We have connectivity, so we can ping the SVI. If we had other hosts on that same port group, we could ping those. And we see from the ACI plugin something called the navigation tree, where we can see everything we've created, security zones and groups, subnets, one or multiple, APs, one or multiple, and their port groups under those application profiles. We can see the health of a tenant. We can see the health of the fabric. We can even see the health of a port group. So this is all from the vSphere or vCenter admin perspective, which is really nice to be able to see that health score. And if there's a degraded health score, they know they can go talk to the physical network team, the APIC admin, and get that resolved. And the APIC admin, of course, has information or faults and events and log audit, log tabs that they can go look to see why that health score is degraded. All things we'll take a lot more detailed look at in the troubleshooting and operations module. And then again, in the vSphere web client, we can click on related objects endpoints. We can see the name, the MAC address, the IP address of the VM, the port group that it's attached to, the application profile and the tenant that it's attached to. And then if we click on virtual machines, we can even see the state of the virtual machine, the guest memory, its name. We can right-click and perform all sorts of actions right here from within the ACI plugin.